Go live button. So here we go. All right. Hello. I'm going to give it a couple seconds for people to join if there's a delay. Hello. Welcome to the Paid Search Association webinar. We're happy to kick this off with Fraser Andrews, but I am going to start out by mentioning our sponsors. So this webinar today is brought to you by Jumpfly, Clever Programmatic, and Ad World Experience. And the best part here is that if you are with us, I am going to be able to choose a winner for an Ad World Experience ticket. I'm going to announce it at the end, and I'm going to choose from the chat. So make sure you interact, ask questions. I'll be working the chat throughout, and we'll definitely have some time at the end for questions. Fraser, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. I've had such a great time getting to know you the past couple of years on Twitter and just through getting on this webinar. So you just recently launched paid media consultancy, and it is called the 0908 Agency, and you've been doing this for 7 years. So you bring a lot of great experience to us today. I'm really excited about this. And you have worked with the client and a wide range of industries, and you have particular interest in international campaigns, which is really, really great for us to be able to hear. I do see some people joining in on the chat, so we're definitely excited to hear from you today. And you've previously spoken at the 2021 Brighton SEO Paid Social Show, and you talked about incorporating sensory marketing into paid media campaigns. And you've also been a contributor to blogs that we've all heard and know about. So this is great: PPC Live, Optimizer, PPC Hero. And then outside of that, you have a particular passion in ceramics and pottery. And hopefully we'll get to learn more about that as we continue. So I'm so excited. Thank you again for being here. Thanks to our sponsors. And I'm going to jump out so you can have the screen, and we'll come back in and chat later. So thanks so much, Fraser.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very exciting. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I'm really looking forward to the talk. Again, if you've got any questions on anything, even about ceramics, just message me and I'm here. So cool. I'll get underway. So today's talk is called The Do's and Don'ts of International PPC Campaigns. And effectively, the talk, I'll go into more details about the origins of it and really my inspiration behind it. But having worked, like I said, in the industry now for nearly 8 years, I found international campaigns to be one of the most exciting types of campaigns to launch. Typically, it normally means that a business is at the point where they have reached a point where they can expand and grow larger. And there's an element of trust, I find, being the agency that's helping to launch with that. So from a trust perspective, that's great. But also, I think, personally, I find arguably the idiosyncrasies between each of the countries really, really interesting and fascinating. And the differences really that can have on search volumes and search practices, I guess. So to go through the talks, I'll talk about the real origin of this talk in a second. I will then be looking into challenging the concepts of similar audiences. And really that's talking about challenging preconceived biases, I guess. Off the back of that, I'll then look at how the differences between the two countries can have an impact on data. And then at the end, I'll say how to correctly, in my opinion, approach international expansion. I will also put an outline out here that this is by no means a political presentation. I do make references between countries. It's just a PPC presentation. There's nothing political about it. But again, I'll have more details on that in a second. So the origins of this talk. It helps if I press the button. There we go. So this is about me again. So as a quick cameo, this is me. I've been working in paid media now for 7 years, multiple industries, multiple clients. I've had some really big clients who've been really exciting. I've had some really small clients also that have been really exciting. One client, I think my smallest client, this always has to come out, was £25 management fee a month, which again, I think that kind of number just spans across all currencies. It was low. So I've had lots of small clients and lots of big clients. So genuinely, I'd like to think that I've covered most of the bases really. And again, helped launch some international campaigns for some really big businesses, which has been fun, and witnessed some nightmares. And it's not just international nightmares. I've witnessed some awful PPC mistakes, some of them myself too. So the origins of the talk. So going way back now to 2019, this is pre-COVID. I was working on an e-commerce client who were in the clothing sector. Very nice client. Spoke with them regularly, and we had a really good relationship. Typically UK based, but did distribution to typically Nordics and some of the DACH region as well. So I got this nice email. I sat down one day. 2019 me was a lot fresher back then. I feel like COVID's taken a few years off all of us. And came into this. So things have been going really well. And we're looking to expand more from a pay perspective, really, out into Scandinavia, Ireland, Germany, and grow as we feel that growing the business in these regions is really important as they're similar audiences. And as soon as I read the word similar audiences, I think there was a shudder that went through my spine, because I think arguably there's a common sense approach here. Looking at this email and reading this back, and being somebody who's based in the UK, I understand, and I think everybody really around the world would understand that whilst we are similar audiences, we are by no means the same. So let's just copy and paste when it gets worse. So this was me. If you could just copy and paste our current setup in those countries, we can get going. And again, immediately, knowing what I've just said there about how we are, by our very nature, very different cultures, people, dialects, all these different things that come into play, immediately I knew when I read those words, if you could just copy and paste our current setup, that this was going to be a long day, I guess. And perhaps a bit too deep into this, but I think this may have been a turning point really in a client's relationship with me. So obviously this is a mega no. So there are multiple reasons why we know that copying and pasting is a mega no. So obviously Google Ads performance can fluctuate in performance all the time. So there is data not just internationally, but also domestically, that we know that CPCs can change. We know that search volumes can be dramatically different by country. So to go in blindly without any research and just say, we're going to pop this live, is going to shoot ourselves massively in the foot. The next point I make here is about burning through spend, and that sort of streamlines off the last point really. Without doing any research into potential CPC costs, without doing any research into potential CPC volumes, and arguably just putting things live blindly, is a recipe for disaster, because again, there could be huge differences in CPCs by country and or intent. So while CPC may be relatively similar, if one country has a significantly higher search volume and a significantly higher chance of clicking those ads, then obviously you're going to be burning through that spend. Obviously, like I said before, it doesn't acknowledge any differences between the countries. And again, there could be so many different factors that come into play here. These could be socioeconomic factors. They could be dialect factors. They could be cultural factors. The list goes on. Contextual factors. So many factors. And it doesn't take that into account. And arguably, it's the epitome of short-term thinking. It's almost as if I got the feeling that the client woke up one day and said, let's do it. Just copy and paste it, put it live, and we'll deal with it afterwards. My response to this was, maybe we should have a think about it. And I was able to calm things down, but that stuck with me for a really long time. And interestingly, a couple of months ago, I came across somebody on LinkedIn who, not word for word, but very similarly said something to the same extent of, if you're looking at launching international campaigns and you already have campaigns set up, one really quick way of getting going is to copy and paste. And then I thought to myself, this can't keep happening. I realized a lot of this seems really common sense, but when I see things like that online, I'm like, I have to actually do something about this, because this can't be the approach that we take universally. So, like I said, I'm conscious that there's some really obvious things that come into play here, but also there's some less obvious things. And this is the section here where I'm going to try to really dig into the concept of similar audiences. And as I mentioned before, the notion really of unconscious bias, I guess, really. So what I've tried to do is show really similarities between two countries that contextually, in the modern context, may look similar from an outsider's perspective, from an audience perspective, but actually are very, very different. So the two audiences I've picked are the United Kingdom and Republic of Ireland. I want to stress again, this is by no means political. I could have easily just have picked the US and Canada, or Australia and New Zealand. Again, my family are all from New Zealand, and I'd like to think we have lots of differences with Australia. So from an outsider's perspective, and I think from someone, and I've seen this done multiple times in multiple client accounts, there are direct duplications when people launch campaigns into the Republic of Ireland, which I think is perhaps naive, to say the least. So I'm going to start with another caveat in this analysis, that it's very, very difficult to compare two countries economically side by side. I'm by no means an economist. This slide is purely to show the importance of socioeconomic data, really. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at one country on one side, one country on the other side, and really looking at how we can build a hypothesis about how these audiences are different. So we can see, looking at it from a very top level perspective, that both countries have really high inflation rates. At the moment, as somebody living in the United Kingdom, we're going through a cost of living crisis. Everybody is feeling it. This isn't just a consumer problem. It's something that's affecting businesses too. And it's actually, interestingly, something Sarah and I were talking about before the talk, was the impact that businesses are having. And this obviously doesn't just affect purchasing decisions. It can impact products, even all the way down to employers and keeping their jobs. So looking at it on face value, both countries have high levels of inflation at the moment. Again, not comparing them, just taking it on face value. If we look further into data around weekly earnings, we can see that the Office of National Statistics says that with regards to weekly earnings in the UK, weekly pay is falling. Whereas if we look at data from Ireland, we can see that actually it's increasing. So initially there, we can already see potentially a difference. Again, not seeing them side by side. What we're saying is that really matter-of-factly, the UK is seeing wages fall, Republic of Ireland is seeing wages rise. So actually, again, finger in the air, we're building a hypothesis already at this early stage. We could test to see what impact or whether or not people in the Republic of Ireland are more likely to spend. Again, very early stages at this point, but we're just taking that matter of fact. If we look further into more detail here, we can see that both countries have increases in consumer card spending, with Ireland seeing a greater level of consumer card spending than the United Kingdom. Again, not comparing them side by side, taking the matter of fact. We can see, if we look at things here, the Republic of Ireland is seeing weekly earnings increase, and also they are seeing consumer card spending increase. So not only do we potentially have, even with this umbrella, I guess, of inflation, we're seeing weekly earnings rise, we're seeing consumer card spending rise. Potentially, we're watching that hypothesis of different audiences change now. Potentially, again, there's more weight here for us to say, maybe things like non-essential spending and client spending can be different in the Republic of Ireland to the people in the United Kingdom. Thinking of that from a campaign manager's perspective, that might mean from a content point of view, we can start to push much more sales-based CTAs in our ad copy. From a bid strategy perspective as well, we can look at ROAS targets and things like that and bid perhaps more aggressively. But again, these are two hypotheses that we're just taking very matter of fact, but we can already see some potential differences between the two countries, which originally we may have considered to be the same. Looking into more detail here, we can see that both sets of countries, again, are seeing direct impacts on consumer spending, which, again, to be expected given inflation and all these kinds of information. The Irish side of things is saying potentially a bit more frugally, but they're seeing consumer spending being pulled back slightly more than the United Kingdom. Again, something for us to consider when we're looking at that hypothesis. And again, a statistic from the BBC saying that actually potentially savings are greater in Ireland, but again, it's just helping us to build this hypothesis and to try and understand that actually there may be differences here that we're not considering. So I think from already, this is very little research. This is just pulling data from the internet, whilst we may have clients that say the United Kingdom and Republic of Ireland are pretty much the same, so let's just put them live. Actually, what we've been able to see is that from a spending perspective and from a socioeconomic perspective, there are differences here that we need to consider. And again, if you wanted to go into greater detail around that, you could, if you're fortunate enough to have business data in your back end that shows consumer spending on that level. Again, you can add that to your hypothesis, and you're just starting to get a much richer idea, really, around the audiences, depending on obviously how much data you've got. I'm conscious that for some clients, some smaller clients or some expansive clients, they may not have access to that business data. That being said, like I've shown here, this is really relatively top level stuff, but we've been able to show the difference here. So knowing this, this is all well and good, really, in a nutshell. If we know this socioeconomic data, this is all well and good, but there could be an argument that some client may say, again, I'd like to argue that this might be, again, naive thinking, that actually this doesn't really impact things. So what I've tried to do is compare non-essential spending, that's the stuff I pulled out, and we pull that data into Google Trends and see how that impacts trend data. So from 4 very top level product groups, I've pulled out clothing. We can see over the last year, there's a slight difference in interest from Ireland versus the United Kingdom. Again, does this correlate with what we're seeing within the two audiences? If we look at entertainment as a topic, again, I'm conscious this is a very broad topic, but from the viewpoint of non-essential spending, it's a good chance for us to review these things. Again, Ireland comes out on top. Restaurants, another one. Ireland comes out on top. And finally, so that's it, really. So what I'm trying to show is that effectively, by looking at all these different elements, we can potentially show that there is a correlation here between the socioeconomic data and the Google Trends data. Again, if you really wanted to go into real massive amounts of detail, there's boatloads of resources you could use for this kind of thing. You could even utilize Google Ads performance tracker as well to show how that's impacted things. But effectively, what I'm trying to show here is that there are notions really that we need to be tackling. I think there is, what I would say, and arguably there's an element of me doing this here if I'm being truly honest to myself, is that we need to be conscious of narratives. We don't necessarily want to go into things here saying the client has turned around to us and says, I want to launch in Ireland, make it happen. And we build a narrative that fits that. We need to be candid and look at data from a what's the word I'm looking for, from a very honest standpoint, and say, if it's not going to show that, we have to be talking to the client, because obviously later down the line, this can be impacting performance across the board, really. And we don't want to be the ones responsible for that. So effectively, what we need to be doing is pulling as much data as we can, doing that initial research, seeing what it shows, and then interpreting it into our approach. So what can we take from this? What we know is that we need to be really challenging those preconceived beliefs and letting data lead the way, really. Again, I think even the best clients can have a really interesting way of looking at it, really. And I think that even the best clients can look at things and be like, well, I know this audience. I know what they're like. They're very similar to from X to Y. So they'll be fine. And it's our job, not just as those who work in paid media, but arguably those as client managers, to turn around to clients and say, actually, we need to be doing more digging into this. So another thing we need to factor in, and again, I will probably divulge more into this in a second as I go into the correct ways to approach it, really, is that it's really important for us to also acknowledge associated costs. So in the United Kingdom, we've also obviously had Brexit and the impact that that's had on businesses over the last 3 to 4 years. And we need to be saying, again, with our campaign manager hat on, to clients, what impact does this have if we were to launch internationally on shipping and handling fees, and acknowledging things like digital taxes that come into account? What impact does this have on our performance? Because again, knowing all this and knowing the impact that the additional associated costs are going to have, it's going to have a massive impact on performance and arguably our KPIs. Off the back of that as well, if you're the person who can sit there to a client and say, A, we need to have a step back and look at this, and B, and this is why we need to look at it, considering shipping and handling fees, digital taxes, this kind of thing, it's only going to build that trust with the client. If they turn around to you and say, I don't care about that, let's just go with it, then I mean, arguably you need to have a look at the relationship with the client and say, is this really the ideal client for me? But you have to do it. In a nutshell, if you're somebody who's passionate about your clients and passionate about the accounts you run and you want them to truly succeed, you really have to look at things from a step back and really say, this is what we need to take into account. And as I mentioned there, how does this impact campaign targets? What it's really important for us to stress here is that knowing regionally that there's so many differences, whether that be handling and shipping fees, whether that be export costs, whether that be even if you really wanted to go into the detail and the nitty gritty of it, what impact could this have on internal business wages? Because if they're having to hire more people to ship stuff out, then that's going to have an impact on the bottom line, really. We need to know from a Google Ads perspective and from a wider paid media perspective what impact that's going to have on us. Because obviously, if we're sat here feeding Google Ads particular ROAS targets, particular CPA targets, and actually what it comes down to the end of the day, actually we're not being profitable, we're feeding it with the wrong information, we're going to be the ones that's left having to answer for that, really. So we need to know what we should be saying to clients when they're looking at international expansion is to say, okay, this is great, really happy for you, here's the research, but also how does this impact our targets? If they're a good client, they'll give you a regional target. If they're an okay client, they'll shove it all together. If they're a bad client, they'll say, don't worry about the targets. That's what we need to arguably here be doing that education piece around. Actually, it does impact targets. So then, we've looked at the socioeconomic data and how that can impact search. We've considered how digital taxes, handling fees, all this kind of stuff can impact our bottom line. So how should we, in an ideal world, if we're going all the way back to that initial email that still gives me shudders to this day, how should we be looking at approaching new markets and international campaigns? Research. that is the most important thing, and I genuinely mean that. Doing the research, looking at as many different pieces of information you can, is going to have a massive impact on not just, like I said, the relationship with your client, but also performance. If you go in blindly into campaigns and you haven't acknowledged separate costs, you haven't acknowledged the impact that performance can have really on your campaigns, then not only are you going to look bad, but also it's going to have potentially a regressive impact on the client and their business. So doing that research and even sharing data internally is going to be massively, massively important. We do need to stress there is no exact science to this. You can, even the best companies in the world that do market research can do as much details and research as they can, and actually it turns around and it's had a completely different impact. That's fine. That happens. Markets change, acts of God happen. But if you can truly say that you've done as much research as you possibly can into fluctuations, you've looked at as many platforms as possible, you've tried to acknowledge as many different end results as possible, then you're going to set yourself up much better. And again, that can have understanding research truly can help you understand things like structure. Am I structuring campaigns properly? You can then turn around to, if you're fortunate enough to have people like translation services, you can then turn around to translation services and say, our research is showing this. Does this correlate with data you have? So do the research, because it's really, really important. Another element is to understand the financial climate. Again, I've sort of stressed this in the first part of the talk, but understanding what impact launching campaigns can have in both a B2C and a B2B environment is hugely important. If businesses in the region you're launching into don't have money, if you're finding that wider trends indicate that there is a drop-off, then is this the correct time? Should we be sharing this information with the client? I think it becomes arguably almost a bit of an ethical conversation. It's very easy for agencies or account managers to say, yeah, let's do this. I think, though, if you know that you're launching into a market where there are downtrends and things are getting more difficult, and you knowingly proceed with that, there is an ethical conversation to be had around that, because arguably this company is hiring you to do services and to offer services, and if you can't provide that, or you're offering something that's alternative really to what they want, then it's going to impact not just the relationship, but arguably how you approach things. Existing data, and I think this is one that people don't really acknowledge enough. I think that we have so many different platforms that exist out there. GA4 obviously is the one that everybody reverts back to. If we have any organic data, if we have any paid data, if we have any data at all that we can help to support our hypotheses before launch, then it's going to serve us, again, massively. It's going to be hugely beneficial for us. But also, when we think about post-launch, we need to be thinking again about how we're tracking that data and how we can use that. Should we consider further international campaigns? Because it's going to, again, knowing how we've launched previously and knowing the impact that we've had really when we've launched, it's going to massively help us shape our future strategies and how we approach further campaigns. Lean on others. And I think this is one, again, that gets missed a fair bit. There are so many case studies out there on the internet of people saying, this company did this and we saw X amount of growth. And I think there's an element of having to cut through that. But if we really look at things matter-of-factly at case studies, we can acknowledge actually that there's some really good data to be had there. There's some really good strategy to be had there. It allows you to perhaps get and acknowledge different approaches and different voices before even launching. So knowing that there are potentially various different case studies out there which show you how to launch into particular markets, it's going to be hugely important to us. So go out there. Again, it arguably falls under the research section, but lean on others, lean on other people's case studies. If you've got contacts and people in other agencies or other campaigns, talk to them. Say, look, you don't have to disclose any confidential information, obviously, but if you can divulge this kind of data and show what you're considering, having these different approaches and understanding these different voices is going to be great when you come to launching campaigns. Plan. So we've done all this research. We've done everything. We've spoken to others. We've considered socioeconomic factors. We've potentially spoken to translation services. From here, we need to be looking at planning. And again, sharing this with the client. I think that's one thing that we neglect to do, really. And I can hold my hands up and say this myself. When we're working on planning and we're working at that planning stage, I think we can typically tend to be quite narrow-minded, and we've got sort of tunnel vision, really, with how we approach things. Arguably, the planning stage is when we should be talking to the client the most. We've done all this research. We've taken so much into account. We've spoken to other people. But if we then neglect the client and the business at that final stage, not only could we potentially be setting ourselves up for a fall and building the most comprehensive plan that then just gets rejected, but also it helps to build that trust. And actually, there may be factors that we haven't taken into account. We don't work in the industry day to day. So if they can turn around to us and say, actually, this happened 2 weeks ago and it means that everything has changed in the industry, then we need to change our plan. So planning is, other than research, arguably the most important thing you could do. So that's that. So really, in summary, I'm conscious it's been a really whistle-stop tour actually of this talk. What I would say is do the legwork on research. We need to be understanding that as an audience and as humans, we all have unconscious bias. We need to be challenging that. We need to rely on the data. There is so much data available to us. We're arguably living in the best age to get data. He says, with iOS 14 and cookie changes happening, but there's still lots of data available. Use that data. Talk to people, talk to clients, lean on each other. And the more research we can do, the more planning we can do, the more we can push back to clients when they say, can we copy and paste things, the better off we're going to be down the line. If I can also give a personal summary, if you can make international campaigns work, there's a pretty good chance you can make a lot of campaigns work, because they are ones that historically I've found can fluctuate in performance, arguably on a daily basis, can change like that. And again, there's masses of context to take into account with that. But if you can make them work, they are great. And again, it helps businesses grow so much when they can move away from just one market, and normally the domestic market. So if you can be part of that journey, it's great. So I would argue that do the research, have a good time with it, have fun, talk to clients, get as much data as possible, get a really good plan in place, and do it. And that's been me.
Well, thank you, first of all. That was great. And I definitely want to take the time for people in the chat if there's questions so we can address them. And I'll go first because as we talked earlier, definitely I know I manage international campaigns and everything you said hits the nail on the head. So what is your thought about the sort of history of the campaign? Because we all know that you can look at the fact that it's a different country, but there's also sort of the behavior of the account in general. Do you find that is a factor as well when you look at the campaigns? Because there have been many times when I think, well, maybe I'm sensing this, but it could just be that's how the account behaves, where it's more sensitive to a sale or ROAS goes up and down, or the scale isn't as easy. What are your thoughts about that?
Completely, and I genuinely think that's a great question. I think it's by no means to be dismissed. I don't think we can dismiss any data. I think there is a massive element of testing that has to come into play for sure. But if we know that information and we go into campaign launches knowing that, let's say, for example, that historically things have performed really well when we have sales, that's great. Arguably, if we know this and we also have all this additional information behind us, this can be our starting point. This can be the bit when we say, if we want to go out into market and we want to start with a sale and we know that historically it's worked well in the UK, let's test this. That's a great place to start. What I will say, and I actually didn't cover that in the talk, but I think this is probably actually something that I really, really should have covered, is that we need to acknowledge as well with new markets that actually paid search might not always be the best approach, especially if it's a brand new product and we're launching it into a market. We have to build that intent first and that awareness first, and search isn't necessarily the place to start there. This kind of information comes out in that research phase. If we know, and again, I've had actually a client experience this before. They were a health client and they were launching a health product into multiple businesses. And what became really, really apparent at the planning stage was that not only was no one aware, obviously, of the brand, it's a relatively new brand, that's kind of to be expected, but actually the product itself was relatively unused in the region they were looking at expanding out into. So what was really clear from our perspective then was that if we were looking at perhaps lower funnel campaigns or campaigns where we were looking to drive sales from the get-go, that probably wasn't going to happen. What we needed to do first was perhaps lean more on building that thought leadership in the regions, and again, leaning more on SEO, organic content, so my brain's having a million thoughts at once. That's another part I can come to. But building that intent, building that desire, building the hype really around it is arguably what should have come first in that instance. But also, if we've got all this data previously, it can be domestic too. That's only going to help us with our planning. And yeah, I think it's a great question. I think any data is massively important, and it helps us really to steer that ship.
Okay, no, and that makes sense. And I think it definitely leads into, and there's quite a few questions in the chat, which is key for a perfect chat today. So somebody said, speaking of data, how do you handle the difference in currencies being pulled for conversion values? And again, definitely something I've experienced in the campaign that I'm running.
Completely. I think it is a difficult one because not only are we taking into account we as humans, we have a rough idea as to conversion metrics and things like that. These change on a daily basis. Again, socioeconomics comes back into play again. We could have great forecasting one day that's based on this data. Suddenly the markets drop and everything's completely different. What I would say is that if you have, it's good probably to give a scale, I guess, really. If we're looking at forecasting, and at the research stage, we're looking at that forecasting. If we have rough ideas as to how the currency fluctuates from across the year, it helps clients to get a better understanding of actually this matters and this matters. Again, there's platforms which can help us with this. Knowing that Google Ads forecasting tool has CPCs by region, that kind of thing is, again, really helpful information for us. But I guess this is such a politician's answer. There is no right or wrong in this. If we're going to help clients, it's giving them a rough idea, I guess. And that's how I'd probably approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Brandon, feel free to clarify a little bit more in the chat. We are seeing these come through, but the question, looking at it, implies that the two countries are being managed in the same account, because the question was, how do you pull different currencies for the conversion values? And now that I think about it, the account that I'm managing, we keep the United States and Canada in separate accounts. So we do have another question out of that, but do you mind addressing a little bit of their best practices, thoughts about
completely. That is a real and apologies, I completely went off on a tangent. Now the question actually does make sense. It's an interesting one again. I think I've had one instance previously where this has happened. I'm very similar to Sarah. I've kept them separately, typically, and that would always be my advice, is to try and keep things separate. Because again, it can lead to difficulties down the line. If, however, you do have this issue, what I would say is I take two things into account. One is that you have, like I've said before, whatever currency it's being exported through to, you use that as your benchmark and you then convert it directly. Then cross-check that with the client, because again, there's nothing worse than you sat there saying, GA4 is saying this, so it must be right. And actually the client's seeing none of that. And again, knowing how much tracking can dip and fluctuate and drop off at the slightest moment, having that communication is important. So what I would say in that instance where you are running it from the same account, use the same conversion, convert it, and then check it with the client.
That's a good point.
Because again, they have business insights. Hopefully they have business insight data, which they can cross-check that with. So
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So the next question came from LinkedIn, and it was, in that planning process, how much importance would you assign to the keyword research as a percentage of your priorities?
Really good question. Again, really good question. And I think it's, as a percentage, that's a really good one.
I know, very a data person, right?
I feel so like a politician today, because I'm going to give a really politician's answer again. Hard to put a percentage on it, but it plays a big role for sure, because understanding at that keyword research level helps us to understand intent, and helps us to understand arguably what desire there is in that market to launch with this. That's where keyword research is going to be hugely important. That arguably is the make or break for many people. If there is no intent, and actually keyword research is showing that there's really low search volumes, then we need to go back to the drawing board here and say we need to build that intent. We can potentially look at this down the line, but we need to build that intent first. If you're really, really super good, you could potentially then lean on other paid media teams and say, if we're looking at targeting this on Facebook, for example, what's the audience size there? If again it's looking small, then it's a bigger brand question. But as a percentage, 35 to 40%.
Okay. No, that's amazing, and thanks for giving us. I mean, we just talked about data, right? So I'm glad they asked a very specific question. I think that was a great question. The next question comes from our very own Brett from the Paid Search Organization, and he wants to know, outside of Google Trends, are there any additional tools that you use, Google, Microsoft, to help in your efforts?
There's loads. That changes arguably on a daily basis. There's loads, without sounding like I'm a salesperson. You can use things like SEMrush. You can lean on SEO teams, which again typically tend to have access to different platforms that we in paid do. SEMrush is a great one for this. It has a lot of information around currencies, around volumes. I'm trying to think of other tools that you may look at. Typically, if I'm being honest, they would normally be considered more SEO based tools, so Ahrefs, that kind of thing. But I guess taking it outside of Google, taking it outside of Bing, SEMrush would be my first place to go. I'm not paid for by SEMrush though, so So do your own research, basically.
No, I get it. So another question, and again, I'm so glad we have this time because I can
Yeah.
be personal in my questions. When it comes to a frequency for updating your ad copy that is either translated, so like for us in the United States, I'm talking about the French Canadian side. And then also, I assume over, we call it your side, right? Your side of the ocean.
Across the pond.
There's probably some different syntax and the way that you would say certain words. How often would you advise looking at that copy? Because, sometimes there's a tendency, it's been translated once, you don't want to pay for that service too often, and then you're dominating one side of the equation.
I think it's a great question. It's something classic Fraser has talked about on LinkedIn before. It's a translation agency, a good translation agency, if you're fortunate enough to have one, is worth its weight in gold, because they step beyond that role of, hi, these are ads, we want to put them live. Okay, great. I've translated them. Let's go. They offer you that regional understanding. They offer you that element of, this is how I would say it as a natural speaker. A brilliant one, and I've had great experience with one before. They've been able to offer not only copy suggestions, but keyword suggestions, negative keyword suggestions. Reviewing that as much as possible is ideal. But arguably, if you've only really got money in the budget with the translation agency to do it once, perhaps getting them to write some sort of rules around avoid this like the plague or keep this is a great way to go. But genuinely, a really good translation agency as a partner is such a good relationship to build when you're looking at international campaigns, because they offer you that extra support, really, that you don't necessarily have. And again, it's very easy for me, as we've said, being really data-led, to look at research, but actually you need to take your head out of the computer sometimes and look at the real world. And these translation agencies have that element to them. So that's that one.
And it could be, potentially, if you're not looking at it often enough. And I think what you sort of alluded to is you would be just as agile in the other language as you are in your native language, the native language of the account manager. I think that's a really, really good point, and a point that, we can take away, I think, being on this call. So speaking of that, and I guess I'll go back to that question that had been asked earlier by Brandon. If you're managing in the same account, I had a circumstance where Performance Max essentially mixed ad languages, and like had a United States headline, or an English headline and a French. Is there ways that you can separate that and avoid that from happening? Is that okay when you're in a country that's dual language? What types of other tactics do you use?
That's a really, really good question. That's actually something I've never experienced, because I think Emacs is one that it's a beast in and of itself. Ways I'd avoid that, if possible, if there is any form of segmenting things, I try to keep that, especially from a language point of view. I try to keep that because I'm just thinking again of places typically like Belgium, as an example. Not only is there French commonly spoken, not only is there German commonly spoken, I believe parts of Italian are spoken there, and there's also, I'm going to say Flemish, I could be completely wrong, Belgian. I'm showing my ignorance here. But having that fluctuation in ad copy is going to be like a foreign language, pardon the pun, some people. So if we can, I guess, segment that as much as possible, that'd be great. There are times when PMax will do its own thing. So that's a really good question. I'll go away and have a look at that one.
That's a really good idea. Potentially even considering a couple different Performance Max campaigns, or I dare to say even with my particular example, potentially even a translated feed. I can't believe I'm giving myself all this work, right? So, definitely these are projects and things to think about that we can sort of have as takeaways. We did get another question in the chat. It's from Ivan on YouTube. So he wants to know, I'm going to read it exactly because it's very specific. So we all know the algorithm learns over time what works. Do you see this experience as a hindrance when moving into a new market using the same account? That's a great question.
It's an interesting one. So are we effectively saying here that is Google's machine learning going to hinder us potentially?
Yep.
I'm actually going to fall back to a wider paid search point here. We should always be questioning what the platform says. Yes, to an extent, it can hinder it for sure. This is me purely speaking from personal experience here. We can't necessarily always take what the platform thinks is right as right. And again, if my brain's doing a million thoughts here, but if we had potentially a client where we were bidding on conversions and optimizing for conversions for one particular regional landing page, if we're optimizing towards this set of conversions, then actually there may be data with regards to people on site. So actually we may be having on-site performance issues that's going to then skew everything else. So it's difficult. It's difficult. We should always be challenging the algorithm. We should always be questioning what's right and wrong. I'm not going to be attacking Google right now, but again, the recommendations tab throws up some really interesting recommendations sometimes. So we should always be questioning what the data shows. And again, I think if we, like I said, this is where all that data comes into play here. If we've got things that show us different and alternative hypotheses, we should be taking these on board because, again, it's really easy for us to slip into the mindset of things are working, it's great. And actually, we should always be challenging that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think continuously asking our clients the best questions, for me, I saw in my circumstance, a significantly higher ROAS, but I then learned through asking the right questions that, oh yes, our price point may be different in that country. And that is a decision that I wouldn't have known without asking that question. And then also to your point, the CPCs in the country varied wildly. The upper media funnel approach varied wildly, and the distribution network all factoring in to the campaign, which leads me again to my next selfish question. Do you typically see, because for me, the product breakdown of what's successful in one country is completely different than the successful product in the other country. And I didn't know how to really say that was happening or why that was happening. But the common factor is that the product that is doing well in the country that it originates in. And it's one different product with a group of all similar products. So let's say you have 50 similar products, and then this one particular one sticks out as performing well, but it's also made in that country. And so there's something going on. Greater brand awareness that you can't quantify, but it's what's happening.
That's that's always a difficult one. And this is where arguably our role, I'd like to think if I was in that position, we should be flagging that with the client, because again, they may have information that can provide that may help, but also it's something for us to share internally, because again, if it's something that, if you're fortunate to work in an agency where there's separate SEO teams and separate CRO teams, they may be seeing the same data and can provide extra information. So pardon the cliche, if you're all singing from the same hymn sheet, it's going to make the clients sort of perk up and go, oh my God, yeah, this makes sense. Oh, let's dig into why that is, because again, it might be a bigger conversation now for the client to have. And that's arguably part of the fun part. I think finding these little idiosyncrasies that happen on a country by country basis can blow things completely out the water. I've forgotten what it was I was listening to the other day. But someone had mentioned about Starbucks launching in Australia and not doing brand research. It might have been a talk. Anyway, and effectively, because they hadn't done the brand research and launched into a brand new location, it tanked. It didn't perform as well. And it meant that they had to completely rechange their approach to international markets. So sometimes things just work and sometimes things just don't work, and there's so many idiosyncrasies to that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that is a fantastic point, and it all goes back to what you said about just really looking at the data. I think really doing your research, knowing the client, and then continuing that throughout the process. We don't just manage a campaign, do the research at the beginning, and then just say, okay, we're done. It's each point of data that we find, we take that back to client. So what can we learn from this? How can we change? How can we evolve? Now, I guess I'll ask sort of specific to your works into our, Europe. It's a different thing than the United States. Do you find there's some different legal differences between countries? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I think from a UK perspective, Brexit has changed everything.
Okay.
Absolutely everything. And even in the build up to Brexit and working with e-commerce clients, predominantly at the time I was working a lot of e-commerce clients, how they were going to deal with that was a really big thing. From a legal perspective, I think the thing that gets missed a lot, and that's why I tried to stress it in this, is just digital taxes.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of times that I see agencies potentially in accounts where I'm auditing, and I happen to stumble across, I don't know, documents that have been shared, whatever, and they recommend budgets, but they don't take into account taxes. Someone still has to pay for that.
Right.
A client still has to pay for that. That's one thing I think that gets missed a lot, and that's why we need to be transparent with digital taxes and say, look, this applies here. In Austria, it can vary differently to what we see in Germany, for example. So legally, there's obviously so many different things we need to consider. If you're really fortunate, again, to work with a client that has a legal team, always check it with them. Always check it. It's a difficult one, and it's arguably something you deal with on a case-by-case basis. But again, it all falls into the research part. If you can do your research and pull these bits out earlier, then again, you're going to look great. So yeah.
Yeah, no, just mentioning that, something that I personally didn't even think about. And it just drives the point home that if you are a client or you are a paid search specialist, it's worth connecting with Fraser and just the paid search organization and reaching out within the industry to make sure you're covered before you just blindly jump into these situations and don't know how to handle them. I think for me, that's been part of the value of Paid Search Association and the community we've built is there is a place to make that connection and say, hey, I'm having this problem and somebody has encountered it before, and then move forward from there, because you're absolutely correct with the taxation that you may not be factoring into your budgeting, right?
And then it has a knock-on effect on everything else. It has a knock-on effect on targets and that kind of thing. And I think you're right. The community is really helpful because, especially with PPC chat as well as the Paid Search Association, they being such a global network, really, there's no reason why even local experts can't reach out. I'm going to use the opportunity to shout out Boris in Germany.
Yes,
Boris,
love him.
I love Boris. Again, there has been times when he shared things, typically on LinkedIn, that kind of thing, around German search. I'm like, oh my God, yeah, that makes sense. Again, we haven't even discussed things like separate search platforms in regional countries. Again, there's so many variations that come into play there. So reach out. That's again, talk to others. We're all here. So.
Yeah. No, in fact, I think because our community has grown so much, I didn't even know he was based in Germany. We've been interacting on LinkedIn and Twitter and through Paid Search Association for a long time. So all really good points. So we actually have 7 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the time to go back to talking about our sponsors. Yes, but please. If we have time for extra questions, I certainly don't want to do anything. I just want to give them their fair shout out. So again, the sponsors are Jumpfly, Clever Programmatic, and then Ad World Experience. And I had mentioned earlier on the call, and I know there have been some of you who have been with us the entire time, that there will be a winner of a free Ad World ticket. And I will announce that at the end of the call in 6 minutes. So I want to make sure that you stay on. I want to give everyone the chance for questions, just so I don't hog the time. But I hope I'm asking questions that are applicable applicable to anyone watching on the replay, because I know a lot of people come into these conversations later on, or it gets shared. This will be shared. So if you weren't here and you're watching it on the replay, we haven't forgotten about you. And then yeah, and we have a 6 more minutes. So I'm excited to get all this time. Okay, so we talked about CPCs. Is there anything you want to share that you feel like wasn't asked? And then maybe the question prompted something.
It's just come back to me, and it's something that I've literally fallen for all of an hour ago. Time zones. Yes. Time zones, so important. So if you're running sales, acknowledge the time zones. I happened to join this call an hour early. My partner and my 2 children had to leave the house to go to the park, and I had to text them an hour and be like, I've missed it by now. Consider time zones. What I will say as well, and this is something that I've fallen foul of before, and it falls outside of international campaigns, but it can be the biggest bugbear of anybody who's working in paid search as life, is when you're setting up an account, make sure you set it to the correct time zone. I've had times before when you've looked to set up rules, and then ironically, the one instance I can think of, the client had set up the account and not considered this, and then sat there having to work out US time to UK time, which apparently is not my strong suit. So time zones are so important. If you get the opportunity, be really, really clear. Again, communication is key. It sounds really cringy, but clarify before going live with time zones and sales, because again, I'm conscious that normally clients have a better understanding of these things as well. So it's 2 eyes are better than 1. So time zones are really important, and stay on top of them, basically.
I'm glad you actually pointed that out, because that brought a factor for me. So Canada, right? So that's where my experience comes from, and I think it's pretty similar to some people. So Canada follows the same time zones, but then you also have to layer onto that the population, right? So for me, I am in Ohio, and a lot of the population that is purchasing is on the West Coast. I get up early. I get up at 6 a.m. I look at my campaigns, especially during a sale like a Black Friday or anything. Yeah. I am kind of panicky. 10 a.m. I'm still panicky. Lunch, I'm feeling okay, but what's going on? By dinner time, I might be ready for that wine, right? Because my blood pressure is coming down. And by 9 o'clock, they're really starting to shop. And then I wake up the next morning, I'm like, it worked. We're okay, because of the West Coast. So I think also layering onto that the population density of the time zones.
Completely.
And it's having these conversations helps bring that out as something that's important to think about.
I think the US is a really interesting one, because as somebody working in the UK, I find it amazing that people who advertise in particular in the US, you're dealing with a continent in and of itself, really. The time zones, the population density, as you said. If one thing I think we're quite bad at doing this side of the pond is targeting the US as a whole. And obviously Washington and Alaska are 2 completely different states. Again, I think so. It's understanding that is really important.
So Brett asked another question here. So he said, how do you coordinate with your international clients with the time difference? And we have 2 minutes, so I'm hoping you can answer that as far as communication, and then also kind of what I said, knowing that drastic difference.
Completely. I think it's boundaries from the get-go, both from communication and performance-wise. Understand the client has to have a level of understanding, if they want to launch internationally, that there will be some differences in time and when we work and when we don't work. So communication-wise, I think you always cover yourself by saying we will reply in 24 to 48 hours or whatever. Humans have to sleep. So if campaigns happen overnight, we'll have to react to it as soon as we possibly can, effectively. But once it arguably gets easier down the line, once we learn more about how campaigns respond, because then we can obviously rely more on automation, scripts, things like that to alter performance for us. Again, though, going back to Ivan, we can't always rely on the algorithms to trust us. So stay on top of things, set up alerts, do everything, do the best practices is how I'd probably deal with that.
Yeah, no, I think that was amazing. And so I guess for the last time, I want to shout out our sponsors. So Jumpfly, Clever Programmatic, and then AdWorld Experience. And with 1 minute left, I'm going to go ahead and pull a winner. So I'm going to pull Brandon as the winner for a free AdWorld ticket, totally at random. And we will connect with you, Brandon. So thank you for staying on with us. Thank you for answering or asking questions and just being a good partner with the Paid Search Association. And appreciate everyone. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys.
I'm going to go ahead and end this and then